Hello, I'm Dr. Gillian Ray-Barruel from Griffith University and QE2 Hospital, and in this presentation I'll be discussing literature review types and methods. So what is literature review? Well, it's an analysis and synthesis of work that has already been undertaken in a particular area. And the purpose or the aim of doing a literature review is to identify what is already known about the research question and what isn't. Why conduct a literature review? Well, you might want to find out what research has already been done in your field. What research methods are used in your field? Who are the key researchers in the field? And crucially, what is still unknown or unclear about this area? Where's the gap? Now, there are two ways to conduct a literature review. One is as the background to a larger study in order to critically evaluate the current literature and justify why further study and research is required. So this might be the background to your research project, justifying why this needed to be done. Or a literature review can actually be a project in itself that to provide a comprehensive survey of the work published in a particular discipline or area of research over a specified period of time. And this is a standalone paper. Now, there are different types of literature review. So in this presentation, I'm talking about the literature reviews that really are standalone papers. And these range from a narrative review all the way up to a meta-analysis, meta-synthesis. And these increase in complexity, but they also increase in the confidence that you can have in the results. So I'm going to step through each of these. Before I do that, I'll just remind you that a literature review is always a systematic process. It is always about defining the research question, developing a search strategy, searching the literature, reviewing the evidence, critiquing the literature, and writing the review. But each of the types of literature review that I'm going to discuss here have slight variations on how they approach the systematic process, but they always have a systematic process. So let's kick off. A narrative review is a simple background to understanding current knowledge. So it's a critique, it summarises, it draws conclusions from a body of knowledge, identifies a gap, points out something that needs to be studied in more detail. Really, it's about helping you refine your topic and research question. It's not particularly useful if you've got a lot of information, a lot of data. It doesn't help you drill into all that. But for a broad brush, looking at, how much data is available in this area and, what does it mean and where are the gaps, it's quite a useful start. So people will often get started in research doing a narrative review. So the methodology, again, it's quite a systematic process. Defining your question, developing a search strategy, searching your literature, reviewing the evidence and writing up your review. You're looking for what research has been done and what's not been done, what's missing. Let's move to scoping review. Scoping review is different because what it is a preliminary assessment of the size and scope of the literature. It is looking at the nature and extent of the research evidence. It is a very systematic process about mapping evidence, mapping concepts, theories, sources, and knowledge gaps. But what it does not do is drill down and analyse the literature. It's very much a broad scoping examination of the literature rather than a deep dive. You're really just looking at what research has been done in a particular topic, rather than how rigorous was that research. It's useful to do a scoping review because then you can see if there is value in undertaking a more rigorous review. So by starting off looking at a broad brush, a broad picture of the evidence, you can then decide, yes, actually there has been a lot of research in a particular field that we can dig into. So a scoping review can take findings from a body of knowledge that is heterogeneous in methods or discipline. And again, it's about identifying gaps in the literature so that you know when you do some research that there actually hasn't been much done in this field. There's not much point in going off and repeating research that's been done and done and done. So before you start your research project, it's important to go out there and scope the literature and see what has been done. Again, there's a scoping review methodology, very similar. Identifying your research question and search strategy, identifying your relevant studies, study selection and data extraction, data sorting, collating and analysis. But when I say analysis here, I'm not talking about a deep dive. I'm talking about a general sifting of studies into their relevant topics, but not rigorously analysing them. And then you summarise and report your results. Now, very simply, the questions a scoping review asks is what research has been done, what methods have been used in this field, what outcomes are people reporting in this field, and what are they not looking at, what's missing. Now, an integrative review is quite different. An integrative review summarises past empirical or theoretical literature to provide a comprehensive understanding of a particular phenomenon or healthcare problem. And again, it can allow for the inclusion of diverse methodologies, experimental or non-experimental observational research. It can be prospective or retrospective studies. It doesn't mind, it takes a broad brush. But the point of doing an integrative review is to present the state of the science. So it's about contributing to theory development. And what is absolutely crucial about an integrative review is you need to then show how these findings have direct applicability to practice and policy. For this reason, integrative reviews are very popular in the health sciences and particularly in nursing because you're showing how the literature is being applied in practice, or if it's not. So, again, define the research question, develop the search strategy, search the literature, review the evidence. Here we're going to appraise the literature. And in this appraisal, what we're looking at is how can these results be applied to practice? And then you write your review. Now, a systematic review is a far more formal and rigorous process. Again, we're identifying and appraising evidence, but here we're really rigorous. We're specifying the time frame of the literature. We're specifying what method of finding the literature, critiquing the literature, analysing the findings, and what method of quality assessment to look at the risk of bias, etc., is going to be included. So how are you going to increase the reliability of these findings? Well, you're going to critique the literature quite strongly. So that's what a systematic review does. It tries to be as comprehensive as possible in gathering the studies, and these can be from published or unpublished findings, such as the grey literature. And a systematic review can be either quantitative or qualitative, which I will step into. So here we've got a process, again, defining the research question, developing the search strategy, writing the research protocol. Now, a systematic review needs a research protocol. It needs to be completely spelled out before you even start. How are you going to search literature? How are you going to review the literature? How are you going to appraise the literature? What sort of risk of bias assessment are you going to use? So all that needs to be spelled out in the protocol. And essentially, we're looking at what research has been done, what methods have been used, what outcomes have been reported. Crucially, how reliable is this data? So you've got this data from various studies. You know, how reliable is it? Were the studies paid for by, you know, the company who sponsored the research? You know, did they find in favour of a particular device that was paid for by the company? You know, there's those sort of questions that you need to be thinking about when you look at literature. Who wrote the paper, and did they have a vested interest in the results? Because that, you know, could affect the bias. And then, as always, what's missing? So what hasn't been studied? What isn't known yet after looking at this review? Now, meta-analysis is an even more rigorous approach than a systematic review, because what a meta-analysis does is it locates, appraises and synthesises quantitative data from a large body of findings, and then uses statistical analysis on the data of those previous research projects. So how this works is, if you've got, say, 5 studies and they all had a similar population and used a similar implementation, then you can pool that data. If you've got 5 studies and they had different populations, for example, some were paediatrics, some were adults, some were in an aged care facility, some were in a hospital, it might not be possible to pool that data. But if it's the same sort of population and you do the same sort of intervention, then you might be able to pool the data. And by pooling the data, it can correct flaws of smaller studies. So if you've got studies, small studies, large studies, etc., if you pool the data, it often gives you a more reliable trust, I suppose, in the findings of the study. You've got a bigger sample size, basically. So it's about integrating and drawing conclusions of research findings and trying to detect patterns and relationships between studies. These studies could be anything from randomised controlled trials, quasi-experimental studies or cohort studies. But in a meta-analysis, the thing to remember is this is quantitative data. We're talking numbers, and the more numbers, the better. So if you can pool some studies and get big sample sizes, big numbers, then that'll be a really interesting meta-analysis. Again, here's your methodology, and we start off with define your research question, develop your search strategy, write your research protocol, because again, this is a very rigorous process. You need to spell it out before you get going on your meta-analysis. How are you going to search literature? How are you going to review the literature? How are you going to appraise the literature? How are you going to do a risk of bias assessment? And for a meta-analysis, how are you going to appraise the collated data? There's a special software that you can use to do this. And then write your review. The crucial things to remember about a meta-analysis is that you're combining data. So the data needs to be from similar populations with a similar intervention, and then looking at, can this combined data provide you with some answers? And this will often be illustrated on a forest plot, which I've got a little graphic there in the right-hand corner. You can see it looks like a little tree. and the results on one side of the line favour the intervention, the results on the other side don't favour the intervention. Each of those little blue line and a dot is an individual study, and the orange diamond is the combined results of the study. And if the combined results of the study touch the line in the middle, then the result is not significant. If the diamond falls on usually the left-hand side, then it favours the intervention, and if it falls on the right-hand side, then it does not favour the intervention. So that's just a very quick introduction to meta-analysis. But just remember, same population, same intervention, you might be able to do a meta-analysis. But you will need statistical support because it's a very rigorous process. Finally, I'll talk about metasynthesis. Now, metasynthesis is also called a qualitative systematic review. And here it's about bringing together multiple qualitative studies. And it is not about statistical techniques. We're not talking numbers here. We're talking findings from phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnographic studies, etc. We're looking at themes and elements. So again, we might be looking at a number of studies, but we're trying to understand, things like what do people say? What do they think? What do they feel? What do they do? We're trying to get a feeling, a broad understanding of a particular phenomenon. And the benefit of a metasynthesis is by looking at a whole range of studies that were done in the same area, with the same sort of population, again, you might be able to come up with a new theory, conception or interpretation of a phenomenon. Now, the data that's used here, as I said, it's not numerical data. It's things like interviews, focus groups, field notes, open-ended surveys, documents, videos and diaries. Very specific methods of going through textual resources and combining those in a way that creates a better understanding of a phenomenon. So it's a very different beast from a meta-analysis, which is looking at big numbers, big data, etc. Again, a metasynthesis methodology, it's the same sort of process: research question, search strategy, research protocol, searching literature, reviewing the evidence, appraising the literature, doing a risk of bias assessment. For a risk of bias assessment for a metasynthesis, we're really looking at what sort of conflicts or what sort of bias might there have been in the way this data was collected. So looking at, who did the interviews, or, what sort of relationship did the people doing the interviews have to the interviewees, or, was there any conflict between the person collecting the data in all of these studies and the respondents? So drilling down into that. And again, that could be a monetary conflict of interest. It could be a power conflict of interest. So having your supervisor collect data on you might be a definite no-no, etc. So you're looking at how trustworthy is the data, because if you know that people had their supervisor interview them, then they're not very likely to, they may not be likely to give honest opinions. So a metasynthesis is really looking at the honesty of the results. How honest do you think people were, and how much can you trust the data? How reliable is it really? Again, analysing collated data. So you've got a whole range of studies trying to see if the combined results in a similar field with a similar population and a similar question, does that give you a broader result than just individual studies? And then crucially, identifying the gap. What hasn't been studied, what isn't known, and where to next? So now I've given you a whole array of literature review methods, and you're probably thinking, well, what do I use? I don't know what to do now. And that depends on several things. What do you want or need to know? Is this just a literature review that is going to provide the background for your own research projects, such as your PhD, etc.? It's going to identify where you need to do your research? Or is this a standalone literature review? You're planning to publish it, you're planning to, promote your findings in your field, etc. Well, if you're planning to do something bigger with your literature review rather than your background to your essay or your assignment, etc., then you need to be thinking about, well, how much money and resources and time do you have? Because to do a thorough, rigorous literature review, such as a systematic review or a meta-analysis or a meta-synthesis, that's going to take time and money. You won't be able to do that alone. A systematic review and meta-analysis, meta-synthesis, by definition, have a team of people looking at the literature, discussing the literature, analysing the literature together, and discussing results. So it will very much depend on how much resources do you have. Do you have people to help you? Do you have people on your team who have experience in literature reviews and skills for the particular type of review? As I said, a meta-analysis needs statistical skills to be able to do that. To do a meta-synthesis, you need some rigorous qualitative analysis skills. So the type of literature review you decide to do depends on what sort of resources you have, what sort of skills you have, and if you have a team to help you. So there's quite a bit to think about there. If you're interested in learning more about a literature review, I strongly recommend you go to the library to have a look. There are excellent books out there on how to do a literature review, all the different types that I have discussed today, and I encourage you to speak to your friendly researcher or librarian because they are invaluable in helping you plan your literature review and really make it easier for you to get your results. Thanks for listening.